Alright, so listen, for me, Bleach is a series that I somewhat struggle to power scale. This is mainly due to it having way too many concepts, which makes me feel overwhelmed with what I have to understand to really understand the series, if that makes any sense. Thus, I decided that I would make a video where I explain one of the most important aspects to power scale the fantasy action adventure shonen, and that's its power system. A notable number of series that fall in the aforementioned genre have some sort of underlying energy system which makes up the versus power system by serving as a base. For example, Naruto has chakra, Dragon Ball has ki, Black Clover has mana, so on and so forth. However, what is Bleach's energy system? Is it Reiyatsu, Reiryoku, Reikaku? All of those terms I just read out have some level of significance in the Bleach verse, and the only one I kinda know is Reiatsu. But what really is Reiatsu? If you have ever watched or read Bleach, then I want you to pause the video right now and try to concisely explain to yourself what Reiatsu is. Try to explain it in a manner that would be reminiscent or akin to you explaining it to someone who has never heard of it. If I had to do it, I'd say something like, it is some kind of energy or force that is possessed by souls which allows them to exert it and apply it in different manners. But is this really true? The problem I have is that for the vast majority of verses I scale, I don't fully understand their energy and or power system. I have a surface level understanding of them. Well, surface level is kind of misleading since it's more like I understand the basics or what's necessary. And while this isn't necessarily bad, whenever I'm talking about it, I feel uninformed, which leads me to doubt my understanding on the topic. So whenever I enter a debate and a topic around it is brought up, I have to consult the Bleach wiki for help and citations to the chapters. And while there isn't anything wrong with this, I'd rather just know it beforehand rather than forming a desultory argument. But this intro is getting kinda long, so let me finish it up real quick. I might have exaggerated my lack of knowledge on Bleach, but that's just the way it feels. This feeling was made more apparent when I made a post on IG going over the Black Clover energy system, which was like some sort of epiphany for me, as it made me feel as if my understanding of the series was massively amplified. Due to this, I decided to start explaining the energy or power system for various different verses I power scale. And given I plan on making multiple vids on Bleach after this one, it was just logical that I should understand the energy system of the verse before going over to make those other vids. The other thing I want to say is that in this video I'll also be debunking a few beliefs surrounding the Bleach energy system. Something to note is that this video isn't going to be a comprehensive explanation of multiple concepts in Bleach. I more so want to understand the topics that are important as part of scaling the series, which is why I will ignore some aspects or things associated with the concepts I will be talking about. So to start off the video, I will be defining and explaining what Reiryoku is. In chapter 59, Urahara states that Byakuya destroyed Ichigo's Hakutsui and his Saketsu. He states that the prior is the origin of his spiritual powers, which is the English translation to Reiryoku, while the latter is his quote-unquote booster. He then states that due to this, Ichigo is just a soul that has no spiritual power. Urahara then furthers by saying that if Ichigo wants to fight a Shinigami, he has to restore his spiritual powers. He explains that spiritual powers are powers that work on one's soul and encourages it. Thus, the more spiritual power you possess, the easier you will be able to move your soul or spiritual body. Given Urahara states that Ichigo is sluggish and has difficulty moving the first time he exits his material body as just a soul rather than a Shinigami, one can say that within Bleach, the more spiritual powers you have, the faster you become. If you've read Bleach, you know that this is something that is also shown. A good example of this is in chapter 210, where the captains remove the limit on their Reiatsu, which amplifies their physical capabilities. Urahara will then go on to say that if Ichigo can move better with his soul or spiritual body than his material body, then he will have regained his spiritual powers. The following chapter then follows Ichigo learning to control his soul, and it finishes with Ichigo regaining his spiritual powers. In said chapter, it's also stated that spiritual powers are easier to amplify, and the rate of amplification is at its highest when the soul is in danger of being destroyed. In other words, I believe this to mean that when a soul or spiritual entity in general is in a life or death battle, their spiritual powers will increase, which will cause them to become stronger and faster. For power scalers, this would basically be a reactive evolution. It is somewhat similar to how Saiyans get stronger. Think about it for a second. Throughout the series, character, especially Ichigo, becomes stronger and stronger throughout either battle, training, and sometimes even through special arms, such as Aizen with the Hongyoku or Yuha with the Soul King. But what exactly is this training? Us humans can increase our strength via straining our muscles, but we will eventually reach a limit. This doesn't seem to be the case with Bleach characters. And how does one go about becoming stronger by just fighting? I believe all of this is explained by saying that Bleach characters have some form of reactive evolution, but I'm not about to reread the entire series to be sure if this is contradicted or not. So if anyone has any evidence going against this notion, cite the chapter in the comments. To answer the question at hand in a simplified manner, Reiryoku, i.e. spiritual power, is a form of energy possessed by all spiritual beings and is the basis for the Bleach energy system. As a side note, in the first chapter it's implied by Rukia that it is rare for humans to have an amount of spiritual power that allows them to both see and interact with spiritual beings. Now we'll move on to explain Reikaku, which is really easy to understand. In chapter 645, it is stated that Reikaku, aka spiritual sense or Reiatsu sensing, is an ability that spiritually aware beings possess, and it allows them to sense or pick up on the spiritual pressure of others. It is basically a sixth sense they possess, allowing them to identify the location in space-time of any being that is using Reiatsu. Those that possess this ability don't need a sense of sight, as this ability works like some sort of spiritual eye that can see all 360 degrees. It should also be noted that when the difference in power becomes extremely massive, this ability no longer works. This is evident when Aizen became so strong that no one could even sense him, which is something I'll talk about later. Now I will move on to what I believe most people are familiar with. Reiatsu, or spiritual pressure, is kind of weird because I don't think there's exactly an explicit statement of how it works. Thus, I won't be making specific citations. This is something that is more so shown within the series rather than explained. However, I will be making citations to the variety of effects it has on other beings since they are explicitly explained. Anyways, let's get on with it. If spiritual power is the amount of energy possessed by one's soul, then spiritual pressure can be thought of as the energy that a being can exert. The strength of one's spiritual pressure is based on the amount of spiritual power they possess. Not all beings that possess spiritual power can exert spiritual pressure. Only those that have trained can do so. Or more precisely, just having spiritual powers don't mean you can use spiritual pressure. I believe a good way to visualize this would be that spiritual pressure is like the total amount of energy and functions as stamina, while spiritual pressure is like the exertion of a fraction of that energy. Let's use the sun as an analogy. It has what one can call an overall reserve of energy, but every second a fraction of that energy is radiated omnidirectionally. Another analogy would be a rocket. A rocket needs fuel to move, and it has an overall amount of fuel within its chambers. When it is being propelled, this fuel is constantly being used. However, all of this fuel isn't being burnt out at once. Only a fraction of it is being used at every instance. This is how I believe spiritual pressure and spiritual power differentiates. Spiritual power is like the potential to do something, while spiritual pressure is using that potential to actually do something. This also explains why characters have certain abilities that drain vastly more energy than something like their punch or a kick. That attack drains more of their spiritual power. So to summarize, spiritual pressure is a measurement of the strength of one's spiritual powers. It is what one would use to roughly determine the strength of their opponent, as it is shown multiple times that within the series, the higher your spiritual pressure, the stronger, faster, and more durable you become. Now I'll move on to explain the effects of Reiatsu. When a spiritual being uses their spiritual pressure, it can have a multitude of effects on both their environment and those that possess spiritual sense. But I will only focus on 4 of them within this video. The first effect is stunning, where spiritual beings have trouble walking, standing, or even remaining conscious in the presence of those that have larger spiritual pressures. An example of this is in chapter 104, where Kenpachi's casual spiritual pressure was so powerful it caused Yamada to fall to his knees, while Shiba looked like he was on death's door. The second effect I'll talk about is fear and illusions, where, similar to stunning, stronger spiritual beings can instill fear into those weaker than themselves and cause them to see illusions of themselves dying or being fatally harmed. Though it can be argued that this effect of Reiatsu can be overcome with willpower. An example of this is in chapter 103 and 108, where as he gets closer to Kenpachi, Ichigo feels as if there's a sword against his neck, and when he comes face to face with Kenpachi, Ichigo freezes in fear and even saw or felt an illusion of himself being stabbed in the back. Later on in the latter chapter, Ichigo is able to calm himself and overcome his fear of Kenpachi, which shows that this effect can be overcome with willpower. However, I can see there being another explanation as to why Ichigo was able to overcome his fear of Kenpachi, though I won't get into it here. Just know that whether or not you can overcome this effect of Reiatsu with willpower is arguable. The third effect of spiritual pressure is erasure. It occurs when there's an ungodly power difference between two spiritual beings, to the point that when the weaker one is within a specific range of the stronger one, their souls are destroyed or their bodies are turned to dust. This also applies to objects, but it seems that the user has to select the object in order for it to work. There are 3 examples of this. The first is in chapter 374, where Stark implies that the souls of his hollow friends were destroyed just by being around him. The second and third are in chapters 409 and 413, where Aizen is able to pulverize the bottle that was thrown at him and erase a chunk of a human that walked near him. Something to note is that one character whose name I don't remember but is a human states that Aizen turns things to ashes, while another character whose name I also don't remember but it's a Shinigami states that Aizen doesn't leave a speck behind. While this ability that is birthed due to a vast amount of spiritual pressure is foreign to both characters, the Shinigami's statement should be more valid than the human's because he has more of an understanding of the degree to which spiritual pressure affects corporeal and material entities. Something supporting this is the fact that we never see any dust or ash residue of the things Aizen destroyed. We just see it disappear. You'd presume that if it was just turned to ashes or was just pulverized, then we'd see like dust or ashes floating in the air, but no, we don't see anything. However, we know this ability can affect the souls of humans and other spiritual beings. Thus, if it can destroy something on a spiritual level, it shouldn't be a stretch to say that it can even destroy the subatomic particles of physical matter, especially when taking into consideration everything I just said. Moreover, spiritual beings such as Shinigamis and Hollows, and spiritual planes such as the Soul Society and Wekomundo are made up of something called Reishi, which is spiritual particles, while material beings such as humans and things in the material world are made up of something called Kinshi. Given Aizen can destroy Reishi and Kinshi is his physical counterpart, then is it not logical that Aizen should also be able to destroy Kinshi, which would be something that makes up subatomic particles themselves? I won't go on about this anymore since I believe I've already justified that it's plausible Aizen can destroy things on a level that is beyond that of the subatomic. The only problem is that we don't know how massive the gap has to be in order for the ability to work. We've seen it work against extremely weak entities such as a bottle or a human, but we don't know where Aizen's power caps off since there's a difference between where a verse can be scaled and where that verse caps off. The latter of which is virtually impossible to prove unless it's explicitly stated that X character caps off at like 1 exaton of TNT or something. Though it should be noted that for Aizen's case, there are characters this ability can affect, so you can just say that it works on those that scale below the characters that Aizen can affect. The fourth and final effect of spiritual pressure that I will go over is transcendence. Similar to erasure, it occurs when there is an ungodly power difference between two spiritual beings to the point that the weaker one can no longer use spiritual sense on the stronger one. A good example of this is in chapter 406, where Ishin states that due to Aizen having grown so much stronger than himself, he can no longer sense his spiritual pressure with spiritual sense. He then ends this by saying that if he were on the same level of power as Aizen, then it's likely that he'd be able to sense his spiritual pressure. Similar to the third effect of spiritual pressure I examined, we arrive at the fact that it's near impossible to know how large this difference in power has to be in order for this to be applicable. Now we move on to the part of the video where I'll be debunking a few misconceptions surrounding spiritual pressure. The first of these misconceptions is that within Bleach, it is believed that having more spiritual pressure than your opponent, i.e. being stronger than them, means you can neg any hacks. This comes from a statement Aizen makes in chapter 391, where he says that the battles between Shinigami are battles of spiritual pressure, and the ones with the higher spiritual pressure will be able to overcome the abilities of those weaker than themselves. He would then proceed to neg Soifon's death hacks just by touching it. The problem with this is that it would be a no limits fallacy to say this applies to all and every hacks ever, and at best, you can say it only applies to the hacks that are shown within the verse. However, I believe that Aizen was just lying, as he has done multiple times in the past, and him being a master manipulator is one of his defining characteristics. Allow me to substantiate my reasoning. Firstly, the entire scene in which he makes this statement I'm talking about was all under the effects of Kyoketsu Ugetsu, so nothing that we see happen within those chapters actually happened. Secondly, Aizen states he can use his spiritual pressure to null abilities, but he didn't null Toshiro's ice, which stopped him from drawing his sword. He also didn't null Shinji's Shikai in that same sequence. Thirdly, there's an ability known as Hanki, which specially exists to nullify Kido-based abilities. So if just having higher spiritual pressure allow you to nullify all abilities, then why is there the skill specifically designed to nullify just Kido-based abilities? It's likely that it exists to nullify the Kido of those stronger than the user, but if what Aizen said is true, then just having higher spiritual pressure should allow you to nullify Hanki as well, because at the end of the day, it is also just an ability. It's also stated that the Yoruichi that uses Hanki in the scene is stronger than Soifon, by Soifon herself. So why didn't Yoruichi just use her spiritual pressure to neg it? I don't know if getting stronger also amplified your spiritual pressure, as there are abilities like Hierro, which I believe amplifies one's durability, and Cero Oscuras, which is 10 times stronger than a normal Cero. So maybe it's possible to amplify your strength without amplifying your spiritual pressure. Either way, if you can neg abilities with just spiritual pressure, then the existence of Hanki is virtually useless. Fourthly, in chapter 623, Aizen was harmed by an ability called the Underbelly, which is used by a character named Najaku, who is vastly inferior to Aizen. Fifthly, I'm pretty sure that there are arguments putting Ichigo above Yuha in terms of spiritual pressure, yet Yuha was able to affect Ichigo with the Almighty. Sixthly, Aizen was weaker than Yuha, but he could still affect him with Kyoketsu Ugetsu. Seventhly, between chapters 299 and 302, Byakuya would fight Zomari, where Shikai Byakuya would state that there's a massive power difference between himself and Zomari. Zomari would then activate what appears to be his Resurrección and use Brujeria on Byakuya multiple times, which would cause Byakuya to cut off his ligaments that were affected. Even after this, Byakuya will go on to say that he is still vastly stronger than Zomari. Keep in mind that he is still in his Shikai form, though it should be noted that it's possible Byakuya was referring to his Bankai state in stating the power difference between himself and Zomari. I just wouldn't say that it's plausible. Either way, Byakuya would then later activate his Bankai, meaning that the power difference between himself and Zomari has been massively amplified. Zomari then states that he'll take control over Byakuya's Bankai, and rather than stating that he can't do so because of the massive power difference between them, Byakuya says that there are too many petals for Zomari to take control over. This isn't a direct implication that Zomari could take control over a few dozen petals, but I just wanted to mention it. Byakuya would then attack Zomari with his Bankai, causing Zomari to activate some kind of shield ability in order to defend himself. Zomari would then emerge from this shield with his body severely injured, which substantiate that Byakuya is far stronger than he is. Byakuya would then go on to one-shot Zomari with his Bankai, which means that it's very possible if Zomari didn't use that shield ability, he would have been killed instantaneously by Byakuya's Bankai. I implore you to read the previously cited chapters, but it is obvious that Byakuya was far stronger than Zomari, yet Zomari's Brujeria still worked on Byakuya. I went more in depth in explaining why Byakuya is stronger than Zomari than I did with my other points, and that's because it's the last point I'll cover, and if I did so for all of them, this section would have been far longer than it currently is, which is already long enough. I'm pretty sure there are more occurrences, but those are just the one I can recall off the top of my head, and I just said that if I were to explain every occurrence in detail, we'd be here forever. Everything I just explained should solidify the argument that having higher spiritual pressure doesn't mean you can just neg any hacks, and it's likely Aizen was just lying, as he has done so multiple times in the past. The next and final misconception I'll refute is that having higher spiritual pressure means you can reflect damage. This is a statement made by Kenpachi in chapter 105, where he states that when two spiritual beings collide, only the one with weaker spiritual pressure will actually get hurt. People use this statement and say that even if a character is slightly weaker than another, they cannot harm the stronger character. The problem with this is that, similar to the previous misconceptions, it is contradicted multiple times when a stronger character fights a weaker one. Allow me to cite some examples. In chapter 342, Ichigo and Ulquiorra clash multiple times, and we never see Ichigo take any of this quote-unquote clashing damage, despite it being apparent that Ulquiorra is far stronger than him, and Ulquiorra himself states that he is stronger than Ichigo. In chapter 344, Ichigo activates his holification and is so powerful that he is able to crack Ulquiorra's sword and casually block his Zero. This causes Ulquiorra to access Las Noches and activate his Resurrección. It is obvious that holified Ichigo grew far stronger than base Ulquiorra in this scene, yet when they clashed, Ulquiorra didn't take any damage, he just ran away unharmed. In chapter 346, holified Ichigo and Resurrección Ulquiorra clashed, and Ichigo doesn't take any clashing damage despite it being apparent that Ulquiorra is far stronger than holified Ichigo. In chapter 384, Shikai Komamura attacked holified Aizen, who was vastly stronger than Komamura, but nothing happened to Komamura. We see no such thing as clashing damage. If it wasn't self-evident that Tozen was stronger, when Komamura is kicked by Tozen, he implies that Tozen's power is vast and will later go on to state that his power is excessive, and Komamura will have to activate his Bankai to contend with Tozen. In chapter 390, Komamura clashes with Aizen on two separate occasions, and in neither occasion is he shown to take this quote-unquote clashing damage. I could go on and on with examples, as there are multiple different fights within Bleach that have the dynamic of one character being dominated by another, yet this effect is never shown again, so Kubo most likely forgot about it. Either way, it proves that this isn't something that is consistent within the series, therefore shouldn't be used as an effect of Reiatsu. I was going to say that it only occurs when the difference in power is extremely massive, but base Aizen is one of the strongest characters in the verse and is far stronger than Komamura. Maybe his Reiatsu wasn't at full power or some, which would just validate my reasoning. Adding to what I just said, I believe this is a way Kubo tried to illustrate that when a character is so much more stronger than another, they won't take any damage from that character. It's similar to how an ant can't even scratch or even move a piece of rock, regardless of what it does, but with enough strength, us humans can move and shatter said rock. It is too inconsistent to be used to say that if a character is just like 2 times stronger than another one, they can nullify all of their physical attacks. Now that we've gone over everything, let me summarize the conclusions I arrived at. Firstly, Reiryoku. Reiryoku, i.e. spiritual power, is a form of energy possessed by all spiritual beings, and it is the basis for the Bleach energy system. When a human has an above average amount of spiritual power, they can both perceive and interact with spiritual beings. It's likely that as you train and fight, your spiritual powers increase, and when you are in a life and death scenario, they will grow very fast and be amplified by a vast amount. Secondly, we have Reikaku, or spiritual sense. It is basically a sixth sense possessed by spiritual beings, allowing them to identify the location in space-time of any being that is using spiritual pressure. Those that possess this ability don't need their sense of sight, as this ability works like some sort of spiritual eye that can see all 360 degrees. However, when the difference in spiritual pressure becomes massive, this ability no longer works. Thirdly, Reiatsu. Reiatsu, i.e. spiritual pressure, is a measurement of one's strength or one's spiritual powers. It is what one would use to roughly determine the strength of their opponent, as it is shown multiple times within the series that the higher your spiritual pressure, the stronger, faster, and more durable you become. When a spiritual being uses their spiritual pressure, it can have a multitude of effects on weaker spiritual beings that can sense it, such as immobilizing them, filling them with fear, making them see illusions of terrible things happening to them, becoming undetectable with spiritual sense, inducing the death of their souls, and even the ability to destroy the subatomic particles of others. Not all beings that possess spiritual powers can exert spiritual pressure, only those that have trained to do so. In other words, just because you have spiritual powers doesn't mean you can use spiritual pressure. I believe a good way to visualize it would be that spiritual power is like the total amount of energy and functions as stamina, while spiritual pressure is like the exertion of a fraction of that energy. In other words, spiritual powers are the potential to do something, while spiritual pressure is using that potential to actually do something. Fourthly, we have negging hacks. There's a misconception within Bleach that having more spiritual pressure means you can nullify abilities. However, this notion is contradicted by the series on numerous different occasions, thus it's not consistent to be used. Fifthly is attack reflection. Another notion is that when two spiritual beings collide, the one with less spiritual pressure will take all of the damage, while the one with more spiritual pressure will be unharmed. Like the previous point, this notion is also contradicted too many times to be used. And yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about in this video. Bye.